could the US actually arrest Vladimir Putin? I mean, it sounds like something straight out of a Hollywood blockbuster, right? But this isn't just a movie plot. It's a question that really pushes the absolute limits of international law and, could risk a global catastrophe. So let's break this whole thing down.
Okay, so picture this. Vladimir Putin's plane touches down on US soil. Maybe he's here for some big, high-stakes summit. But here's the kicker. There's an international arrest warrant out for him. So what happens? Does the Secret Service roll out the red carpet? Or do federal agents come out and slap on the handcuffs? Well, the answer, it's a lot more complicated and honestly, way more dangerous than you'd probably think.
So to really get a handle on this whole dilemma, we've got to start with the warrant itself. Where did this thing even come from? And maybe more importantly, what kind of power does it actually have?
All right, so the warrant comes from the International Criminal Court. You've probably heard of it as the ICC. It's based out of The Hague, and it's basically the world's only permanent court that can go after individuals for the absolute worst crimes you can imagine, things like war crimes and genocide. The whole idea is for it to be this backstop for global justice, right? A place where the idea is that nobody, no matter how powerful, is above the law.
And this specific warrant against Putin, it was issued back on March 17th, 2023. And the charge, wow, it's incredibly serious. We're talking about the alleged war crime of unlawfully deporting and transferring thousands, literally thousands of kids from occupied parts of Ukraine into Russia. The court was pretty clear, saying they had reasonable grounds to believe Putin himself is criminally responsible for this.
So that leads to a big question. How do you even enforce a warrant like this? I mean, the ICC doesn't have its own global police force or anything. It has to rely on its member countries, all 123 of them. And in theory, every single one of those nations is legally required to arrest anyone with an ICC warrant if they show up on their doorstep.
But, as you can probably guess, theory and reality are two very different things. Just look at what happened with South Africa. They're an ICC member, and they were supposed to host a summit Putin might have attended. Their president basically came out and said, look, arresting the leader of a nuclear power, that isn't just some legal checkbox. It's a massive geopolitical move. He said it would be, and I'm quoting here, tantamount to declaring war.
And that brings us right back to the United States. I mean, if even the member countries are this nervous, where does that leave the US, which has let's just say a very unique legal and political relationship with the whole thing?
Okay, so this is where you see a major direct conflict. On one side, you've got the Rome Statute. That's the treaty that created the ICC and binds all its members. But on the other side, you've got US law. And here's the deal. The US is not a member. In fact, it's not just that they're not a member. They have a law on the books nicknamed the Hague Invasion Act, which basically authorizes the president to use military force to free any American or allied personnel being held by the court. No, I'm not kidding. So, if we're talking strictly about the official channels of international law, the answer to our question is a very clear no. The US has absolutely no legal obligation to enforce that ICC warrant. In fact, its own laws pretty much prevent it. So, case closed, right? Well, not so fast. Because what if the US just decided to bypass international law altogether? What if they decided to just write their own rules? This is where our little thought experiment goes from a legal discussion into something much, much darker. So let's just throw that old question out and ask a new one. What would happen if the US ignored the ICC completely and decided to go it alone, using its own legal system and its own military might?
Now you might be thinking, okay, this is pure fantasy, but it's not. There's actually a chilling, real-world playbook for exactly this kind of thing. Our source material points to a really shocking, though in this context, hypothetical example: the US capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. So here's how that playbook works. Step 1, forget international law. You start with a US domestic indictment for something like narco-terrorism. Step 2, you put a huge bounty on the person's head. Step 3, you send in special forces to grab them. And the final, crucial step, you frame the whole thing not as an act of war, but as a law enforcement operation. See how that works? It's a way to try and sidestep that whole tricky debate about head of state immunity. Okay, so what would happen if the US tried to use that playbook on Vladimir Putin? The answer is terrifyingly simple. It would be interpreted as one thing and one thing only. Russian officials have been incredibly blunt about this. You have Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, who didn't mince a single word.
He said any attempt by any foreign power to arrest Putin would be seen as a flat-out declaration of war on Russia. End of story.
And we need to be absolutely crystal clear about what declaration of war means in this context. The warnings coming out of Moscow aren't just about tanks and planes. They have said over and over again that a direct threat to their leadership could escalate. And yes, that could potentially lead to the use of nuclear weapons.
So you see, an attempt to arrest Putin, doesn't matter if it's through the ICC or by force, it stops being about just one man. It becomes about the very foundations of our global order and the truly terrifying price of unchecked power.
An act like this would basically be tearing up the international rulebook. You're talking about violating the UN Charter, shattering the whole idea of head of state immunity that kind of makes diplomacy possible in the first place, and it would set an incredibly dangerous precedent. It would mean trading the pursuit of justice for one person for the risk of, well, total global anarchy. Which brings us to one last really tough question. On the one hand, you have the ICC warrant. It's a demand for justice. It's an appeal to this idea that there's a higher law that should apply to absolutely everyone. But on the other hand, you have the cold, hard reality of geopolitics, of raw military might, and of course nuclear weapons. And that reality creates a powerful, undeniable veto. So it forces us to ask, in a world like ours, when justice has a warrant but power holds a veto, who really gets to write the law?